I mean, most of the wars today are being conducted in the cities, and if the ICRC is one of the oldest humanitarian organizations in the world, 153 years. In fact, we base ourselves on Geneva Conventions that were created for this very symmetric, kind of battles where you have Army A and Army B, fighting each other. Everything is, more or less structured. Where this is not the case anymore. The warfare today is very asymmetric. You have proliferation of groups. You have really, the kind of the fighting moving in the cities. And once the fighting moves into the cities, you have a very compounding, very striking effects on the civilian populations who actually live there.
What have you seen? You've reported from Taiz when it was first under siege. You've followed it on. You've just come back. How has it developed?
Well, as you know, Taiz has always been one of the most water-scarce places anyway in Yemen. So when the siege was put in place, that was one of the most immediate impacts because water was already being trucked into the city as it was. And so the people's most immediate need, obviously on a daily basis, was for water. But infrastructure-wise, you've had hospitals destroyed, and the same situation on the schools are operating, obviously. In Yemen, that's also the situation over wages. I think
people adapt.
People do adapt to a point, I think. But I think the situation in Taiz, which is affecting everybody as well in Yemen, is obviously the cholera issue and hunger. And without the infrastructure in place for the medical facilities, with the hospitals basically operating at less than half their capabilities, that people aren't able to access medical care when they need to.
I think what war does generally is it lowers the bar of what is socially acceptable to such a low level, and then if you have children in that environment, we're all products of our environment. They're growing up in an environment where what is normal is simply just not acceptable, but it is acceptable in those environments. And I was telling you earlier as well.
I mean, you just came out of Mosul,
okay.
So it was really at the heart of the fight against IS. What's changed? I mean, how are people recovering from that?
So it's really interesting to go back to Mosul actually. So I was there about 4 weeks ago, probably a bit less, both sides, east and west. And the east, life has returned to some degree, but you still have problems with things like water, which you mentioned, contaminated still by bodies, believe it or not. So the base level, although life has returned and people are back there, it hasn't really. There's still instability with security. There's still ISIS sleep cells. There's still remnants of war. And when you cross over to the west side of the city, I mean, the West, to be honest with you, particularly the old cities, looks a lot worse than that. The sort of most alarming thing, to be honest with you, again, coming back to the kids, you have all these bodies in this environment that's also littered with IEDs. And the kids are playing amongst them, and as grimly as it sounds, sometimes they're playing with them. And so if you think about that and the traumatic impact of that going forward, that's then issues that go on for generations.
What's always struck me about the war is how cities are very, very, it seems to me, very resilient. So no matter how much you batter them and how much you take things away, there seems to be, in a city that's well established, a kind of basic immune system that means people can cling on somehow. Education will cling on somehow. Remarkably, utilities somehow are kept going quite often, and that's how, of course, civilians continue in some way to exist, kind of between the front lines. Whether they're in cellars or not, or coming up from their cellars during the day, or whether the fighting starts at night and you evacuate and you come back. So I think that was kind of my biggest impression of it is the odd kind of resilience of human settlements, and especially cities in the face of conflict.
And I think Aleppo is one of this example when the society economically will be struggling for the decades.
In what way?
Well, first of all, I mean, to reconstruct the city of Aleppo, especially the eastern districts, it will be a huge task. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't know if, I'm sure plenty of people visited Aleppo before the war. I mean, it's the districts around the old mosque and the souk, so the core economic center, but also the outskirts, so the whole industrial center, of Syria, because this is what Aleppo used to be. It's all in tatters. It doesn't exist anymore. It's a rubble.
So what's the solution? I mean, you dared to ask this question in the report. But you guys didn't go into too much detail with answering it, so.
Yeah, if we had the answer, we would probably write it down.
Yeah.
But you see, the answer is, I mean, it's not up to ICRC to give the answer. The answer, I mean, the responsibility for how the warfare is conducted lies with the parties.
I want to open up the floor for questions.
In Yemen, what comes very firmly across to me from your testimony is that there are external parties which are states. I mean, you're describing the UAE. I lived in Yemen in time of peace. UAE was not funding soldiers, and so they can be forced to comply. I think the case that you have to make to save and other people is, yes, there still is a role for international humanitarian law, and it could work in Yemen. We could force parties to the conflict. They may not sign up to it, but states which are backing them can be made to comply if the rest of the international community was serious about international humanitarian law.
War breaks society down to its lowest form, and you can rape in war, you can execute children, you can do whatever you want. How wars are conducted comes down to individuals and leadership. So you can say that there should be more rules and things like that, but it's a fantasy. It's not how it works. You can have a group that's armed. These guys used to be accountants, painters. Now they've got power because they've got a gun. They're going into a village where there's limited resources. They're taking what they want. I'm going to rape her and I'm going to shoot him. You can have all the rules you want. It doesn't work like that. But they're absolutely crucial. And the work you guys are doing is crucial because it keeps that level that we need to be achieving.
Back to the question about the UAE, and of course that's relevant with Saudi Arabia and all of the coalition partners, really. I mean, it's just as relevant to the Houthis and Saleh, but they're neither a state, neither are they backed by the international community as a whole, pretty much. So, which is the case with the Saudis and the UAE. And this is the problem. It's not really a job for ICRC, for example, to be doing when that pressure hasn't even been brought to bear at a diplomatic level, never mind anything else, on countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, by our own government, by the American government, and if anything, the American government is supporting them even more now, and so are we, for many reasons, including Brexit now and all the investment interest, in addition to the weapons sales and everything else. So yes, I mean, our government should be putting pressure on them, absolutely, because